So the harsh reality is we are living through and slowly becoming conscious of the decline, relatively speaking, of the American empire and the rise of, 2024 doesn't yet allow us to say what's coming next. Could it be a Chinese empire? Clearly, if past is prologue, it may well be. But it's also possible that the Chinese mean it when they say they seek a multipolar world, not another empire. And at least for the moment, it isn't clear whether they can achieve that goal or even whether it is altogether their goal. But for the United States, we are in extraordinary.
On this episode of the What the Finance podcast, I have the pleasure of welcoming back Professor Richard Wolff. So Professor Wolff is a well-known critic of an alternative contemporary economic system, host of Economic Update and founding director of Democracy at Work. So Professor Wolff, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Glad to be here, Anthony. Good to talk with you.
Yeah, looking forward to the conversation. A lot's happened over the last 6 months since our last conversation, but I think a lot of us are, end of the year, we're sort of in a reflective mood. So maybe from your perspective, how would you describe, I guess, the economic impact of 2024 and just 2024 in general?
Well, I think it has been a momentous year on many levels, but to get to the core as quickly as possible, I think we are now living through the decline, the definitive decline of the American empire, along with the deepening crisis of the American capitalism that both produced that empire and depended upon it. And therefore, the two things are happening together. It has plunged the United States into levels of difficulty it was not prepared for, and that it did not, in general, with very few exceptions, expect to see. If not in the immediate future, for many of them, ever. What do I mean? I mean a working class, the vast majority of the American people, that finds its conditions fundamentally under attack. Real wages have not gone up in this country. And by real wages, again, I simply mean the money wage you get adjusted for the prices you have to pay. You can afford as much today with your wages as you could in the 1970s. It's extraordinary. The illusion of a rising standard of living has now been burst because it is now understood to have depended for all that time and at this minute on levels of debt that are generally recognized as unsustainable. Government debt owed by the U.S., corporate debt owed by the business sector, and personal or household debt owned by the mass of people are all at or near record levels. Therefore, no one knows how an economic downturn, when next it hits, will ramify across such a deeply indebted, crisis-ridden capitalism. And the signs of empire decline only became clearer across the year 2024. We are losing the war in Ukraine, which should have made people understand by now this is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is a war between Russia and its allies, mostly known as the BRICS nations, and the United States and its allies, mostly known as the G7. In that war, Russia has moved and taken over, in effect, about a third of the country. It is far west of where its former border with Ukraine was, and it's therefore crystal clear who's winning and who's losing. And the destruction of the Ukrainian economy and of many of its cities and railroads and energy system are all testimony to that reality. The corresponding damage on the Russian side is inconsequential. That is a reality. And coming after the American loss of the war in Vietnam and loss of the war in Afghanistan and loss of the war in Iraq, the handwriting is surely on the wall. I would also say that the reality of all of this, while still not clear in the minds of the American people, is lurking just below the surface. So, for example, Americans have become aware that the real competitor of the United States, and it's a competitor in the economic sense for the first time in a century that could be and has been called the American century, because the American empire replaced the British Empire, which could make that claim for the 19th and part of the 20th century. It became clear that China was the new competitor. China, at the beginning of the year, had an alliance with 4 other countries, the 5 countries making up the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. By the end of the year, 6 other nations had formally joined the BRICS, and another 10 to 20 have indicated their desire and intention to do so. This makes the BRICS a global bloc, a part of the world economy, allied together. And if you do the arithmetic, which economists like me do, you will know not only is the BRICS taken together now well over 50% of the people on this planet, but they already, if you add them up, have a larger GDP, gross domestic product, a rough measure of the total output of goods and services in a year, that is already significantly higher than that of the United States and its G7 allies: Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, and Japan. So the harsh reality is we are living through and slowly becoming conscious of the decline, relatively speaking, of the American empire and the rise of, well, 2024 doesn't yet allow us to say what's coming next. Could it be a Chinese empire? Clearly, if past is prologue, it may well be. But it's also possible that the Chinese mean it when they say they seek a multipolar world, not another empire. And at least for the moment, it isn't clear whether they can achieve that goal or even whether it is altogether their goal. But for the United States, we are in extraordinary difficulty. Lastly, one of the signs of such difficulty is a level of desperate, incoherent political leadership and policies. The election of Mr. Trump is one symptom of the decline of this empire. So too is the attack on allies who are being browbeaten on the grounds that they're not contributing more to the alliance because the United States can't afford to do what it has been doing and doesn't know how to fix the situation. The intense scapegoating inside the United States of immigrants, of the Chinese, and of a random collection of other demonized others. These are signs of decline. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when the American economy and empire were growing, it invited, it welcomed, and it productively integrated waves of immigrants, huge waves of immigrants. The scapegoating instead, the promised deportation of millions that Mr. Trump has promised, are not the sign of a problem with immigrants. It's a sign that the United States economy is not growing, cannot absorb what it once used as a means to its own advantage and growth. That's a sign of weakness. And so too is the end of a commitment to neoliberal globalization, free trade, and all of that. Just as happened in the British Empire, free trade is no longer advantageous. So it's going to be unfree trade, or what is more politely termed protectionism. And the United States, especially under Mr. Trump, but there was no big difference here from Mr. Biden either, is becoming nationalist and protectionist. It cannot operate a global economy anymore. Only gestures are left for that, while the reality is a turning inward, and in the name of isolating its enemies, what you have is the United States isolating itself.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. And I think, it's a good point that oftentimes empires don't realize they've collapsed until afterwards. The Britain, probably 1930s, and then after World War II, that's when it really realized. Rome as well. There's lots of examples of that. And I think, my one question is about this. Is there a potential that, say, after World War I, there was a sort of inwards looking US? Is there something similar that could happen in, sort of a roaring 20s? I feel like the sentiment at the moment, people are quite positive about what could come.
Well, I think it's very insightful of you to say so. Why? Because in the last couple of weeks, we have seen a remarkable emergence of that kind of thinking, although it has not been picked up very widely in the United States, probably because it's frightening. In any case, the former leader of the Republican Party in the Senate, a senator named Mitch McConnell, who isn't the leader of that party anymore. He is an elderly person. He stepped down. He's still a senator, but not the head of the GOP in the Senate, but very influential. And he went critical against the new Republican president coming in next month, Mr. Trump. And he attacked Trump for being, quote unquote, an isolationist. What Mr. McConnell is pointing out, as your question also does, is that the turn to protectionism, literally the slogan America First, which is what this movement of isolationism back in the 1920s also called itself, the America First movement. He was saying to Mr. Trump, you better be very careful because we are not in the conditions of the 1920s. and an isolationism that was possible as a strategic move then, by the way, ultimately undone by World War II and the active intervention in that war undertaken by the Democratic President Roosevelt. But Mr. McConnell was telling Trump, you don't even have that room that you had a little bit in the 1920s. And it might be useful to answer your questions by spelling out what Mr. McConnell didn't. Here are the key differences. In the 1920s, the United States, while an important up-and-coming capitalist economy, was really still only one of a contesting group. The Japanese contested. Even despite the end of World War I, the Germans rapidly rebuilt their economy, demonstrating that capitalism can come back from cataclysmic world wars if there are the conditions enabling them to do so, which there were at that time. But for the United States, it was still a relatively small global player. It did not depend on global supply chains the way it does now. It did not depend on a global market the way it does now. It did not depend on global capital markets the way it does now. And for those reasons, turning inward and cutting yourself off from the world is a much more difficult undertaking, especially because the last 50 years, the last 3 decades of the 20th century and the first 2 of the 21st, were times of massive outflow of capital from the United States to the rest of the world, the creation of global supply chains, the hollowing out of American manufacturing industry and moving it to Asia, Africa, and Latin America, operating a global system, utilizing the US dollar as a global currency. All of those things make turning inward very difficult, very costly, and therefore liable to provoke many American capitalist corporations to oppose that protectionism because it hurts their interests outside the United States, which have become so much more important than they were in the 1920s. So it might turn out to be, and many of us believe it will, that while it is clever politics for Mr. Trump to talk a big language of punishing foreigners, deporting migrants, imposing tariffs against close allies like the Canadians and the Mexicans. That all looks good. It looks tough. It's the old American empire flexing its muscles, or so it seems, on the evening news. It did get Mr. Trump elected. But as real economic policy, much, much, much more difficult. Much of what he says will never happen. He won't even propose it once he's in office, or if he does, it will go down to a defeat. And as is normal in American politics, the Democrats who will help kill his program will go out of their way to hide how much damage they're doing in order that they can attack him later for failing to get his program through. And in case this is murky, let me spell it out. Tariffs are a kind of tax. You can see the chaos of the Republican Party, because it's been a party that for the last century has led the way in being, ready, opposed to taxes. And yet its proposals of Mr. Trump to impose tariffs is an immense program pro-taxing. It'll levy taxes on Americans the way they haven't seen for many, many, many decades. It will raise the prices of everything. And it's anti-inflation. That was another part of how Mr. Trump won. How is he going to work this out? No one knows, him included. This doesn't work. And enraging your allies, which his proposals are certain to do, only weakens the United States further. And all the gestures and all the symbolism of a powerful America will not paper over the kinds of crises that he faces. And if he deports millions of Mexicans and Central Americans, not only will such an act plunge those countries into economic and political extremity, which, if they can't migrate away, will produce revolutionary turmoil in that part of the world with unknown consequences. But it will also mean that the super exploited immigrant here in the United States will no longer be a source of the super profits of many corporations, especially in the fields of agriculture, in the fields of entertainment, restaurants, and in the field of construction, where these undocumented, underpaid workers are the source of enormous economic wealth being produced. Remove that, you remove the wealth. If we had a boom in rentals and in home prices, which we have had, making housing unaffordable for millions of Americans, that would get much worse if he carries through. In other words, we're seeing a government full of gestures, but also full of policy contradictions for which no clear solution is on the horizon. We are truly an empire in dire straits of trying to come to terms with what it is going through.
Hey everyone, sorry for interrupting. I just wanted to extend a massive thank you to you for listening and tuning in, and for your support over these 3 years. So we've had, hundreds of guests that we've welcomed on the podcast. We've had millions of views with hundreds of thousands of different people listening in. So I just wanted to thank you. You know, I started this as a student. I'm now currently working, and I've always done this on the side just because I have a passion for it and I've enjoyed it. And probably similar to yourself, you listen to all these, different YouTube channels and podcasts of people listening to different guests. That's how I started, and I just wanted to sort of take the plunge and be able to have the opportunity to speak to these people, and you've made that happen. So thank you very much. Just myself, don't make any money from this, and it's really a passion project. So thanks for supporting that passion of mine. If you wanted to support the channel, all I ask is if you could like, subscribe, or even comment, positive or negative feedback. I'm always willing to take constructive criticism. I'd really appreciate that. But otherwise, thanks so much. If you can believe it, only 14% of our listeners actually subscribe to the podcast. So if you can, great. If not, no problem at all. Thanks for listening, and let's get back to the show. Yeah, lots to touch on there. Does it make sense for there to be this sort of basically shadow illegal migrant workforce as well, and then for wages to go up? Because it might be a simple point from my thinking, but then I feel like it's quite hard for those two things to be there.
Well, if we had time, I would show you, because it's not difficult to show you that a good part of the migration into the United States, particularly from Central America, is the fruit of American foreign policy itself. In other words, here in the United States, it is treated as a kind of deus ex machina, some surprising, mysterious fall upon us of a social problem. No, no, no. It is the result of policies that have damaged the climate there, which we understand, policies that have made the economies there deeply troubled. In a way, let me be stark, but to be clear, what the United States did in and to Mexico and in and to many of the other countries in Central America, sometimes alone, often in cahoots, in collaboration with local elites in those countries. What that did was to confront the mass of people with basically two options: stay at home and preside over the death of your farm, your job, your family, and yourself, or migrate, go someplace else where the conditions are not what I just described facing you. And those people faced that decision and decided to try against all odds, with no support, to migrate thousands of miles to a country whose language they did not speak, whose conditions they did not understand, but they knew only that they were better than the death they faced at home. The United States is going to have to deal with the consequences of its own policy, if not in the form of migration, then in the form of an exploded Central America. Those people are not going to simply lie down and conveniently die. Few people do. And this is all occluded by dealing with immigrants as if they were a mystery, have nothing to do with the United States, except to burden us with their presence. As I said before, this is a complete nonsense based on the history of this country, which is a history of becoming a powerhouse in the world precisely because you attracted and successfully integrated immigrants. You can't do that anymore. You ought to wonder why. But pretending that you don't need to, that you can deport, is as stupid about understanding social processes as destroying the climate and destroying the economies of those societies was in what led to the migration. But again, Americans are not stupid. They're no more or less equipped to understand their conditions than anybody else. So you need to ask the question, why would a society as capable of creative analysis as anybody else be so stunningly poor at it suddenly? And the answer is nobody wants to see clearly the decline of their own empire and their own society. And that's unfortunately where the United States sits. And it's unfortunate not just for the United States, but the United States is in a position, and here I address myself above all to the Europeans. The United States is in a position to soften its own dissent by using Europe as a cushion for doing so.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty bleak trajectory, but then I'd be interested in hearing, is there any action that could be taken to sort of change the trajectory, or is it sort of already too far gone?
My guess is it's too far gone. I hope I'm wrong, but my guess is it's too far gone. Let me put it a little bit differently. It might not be too far gone, but given the utter blindness of the American political class, once you take that into account, yeah, then it's too far gone. And let me give you the simplest and the most obvious example. And if it isn't obvious, well, then you're caught up also in this sad story. When Russia invaded Ukraine, as it surely did, in February of 2022, it confronted the West, as it knew it would, with the problem. Russia is a large, big, rich country relative to Ukraine. And therefore, this is not a fair fight. This is not a question about the outcome. This is the Russians, possessed of nuclear weapons, wielding their power. They take the situation to be an existential threat. Honestly or not, I don't know. But that's their position. And the West then made a decision, led completely by the United States, seconded by, Boris Johnson and Emmanuel Macron and the other, I'll be general now, leaders of Europe. But the decision they made was they can defeat Russia by waging economic war upon Russia. That its weaknesses politically, Russia's, and its weaknesses, they thought, militarily, and its vulnerability economically, the West had a clear shot at winning. And in the early months, let me remind you, Mr. Biden, as president of the United States, and the leaders of Europe all boasted about how Russia was a gas station masquerading as a country, and that the ruble would collapse, and that the Russian economy would collapse, and that with the mother of all sanctions applied to Russia by the powerful West, the outcome would be predictable and devastating for Russia. That's what they believed. That's the basis upon which they acted. And now the point. Everything about that calculation was wrong, was mistaken, was inaccurate, and was devastating. It turned out Russia had real allies. If the Europeans wouldn't buy Russian oil and gas, India and China would and did. Russia is fine as an economy. This year, according to the IMF, Russia will grow faster than the United States and faster than any other European country. The opposite of what the West calculated turned out to be true. These are signs of blindness by our leaders. They don't know what they're doing. They do not understand the obstacles in their way. So far, their miscalculations have cost the West hundreds of billions of dollars lost in the war in Ukraine. They have cost Ukraine millions of people that have left that country and who will not come back. The devastation across Ukraine is obvious to anyone who pays attention. The miscalculation is catastrophic. And any honest assessment of where we are would have to confront that and explain that. Otherwise, you have no understanding and no explanation, and all you're left with are childish demonizations of Mr. Putin, as if his positive and negative qualities are what's important here. They aren't. They never were. The demonization is a substitute for the analysis because there isn't any. And otherwise, smart people cannot look their own decline in the face. They all grew up, led by Mr. Biden, they all grew up in the heyday of the rising American empire. They have to go in order for a new generation to become in a position to actually ask and answer the obvious questions about how the United States is going to navigate its decline, because the decline is certain. Navigating it, how you manage it, that's still open to some degree, but the blindness suggests it's not going to go very well.
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't look like it's going in that direction. But Mr. Wolff, thanks so much for your time today. Very much appreciate. Your insights. My last question is: what is one message you'd like people to take away from our conversation?
Well, the irony is, if I can say so, that there is a kind of lesson in the relationship between Britain and the United States. You can look at that history very briefly and say that when the colony here in North America decided to break away from Britain in 1774 and 5 and 6, the British decided to try to hold on. Their empire was inviolable, and they would send an army over here to punish the colonists. To the surprise of everybody, the British lost that war. And in 1812, they tried again, and they lost again. And for the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th, Britain and the United States didn't have another war, did not fight each other, did not destroy each other. They reached an agreement. The United States took as its empire, informally, Latin America, the Monroe Doctrine. Britain concentrated everywhere else, which was a reasonable working out of a non-militarized arrangement. Here's what needs to happen now. The United States has to show the same understanding that Britain was able to show after losing twice. Hopefully, in this era of nuclear weapons, the United States will not have to lose twice on a nuclear scale. Maybe the losses in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine will teach a lesson. And then the United States will have to sit down with the People's Republic of China and the rest of the world to work out a way for the poor countries to grow out of their poverty without the rich countries having to destroy everybody's options and everybody's chances. But that would require a major change of mentality, and much of what I do and people like me are doing around the world today is pleading for the rationality of that way of moving forward.
Great message to take away. So, Professor Wolff, thanks again. If anyone wanted to find out more about your work and what you do, where would the best places for that be?
This easiest way would be here below my face, democracyatwork.info. Through that website, you can get to all of the work, the media, the books, the videos, all the stuff that we produce.
Great. I'll put it in the description below. And as you said, it's right there. But thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Anthony. And I look forward to the next time we can get together and talk.
Same. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate the support. If you've got value out of this, I'd really appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, or comment, good or bad feedback. I'm always open to that. But it really helps with the channel. As I said before, only about 14% of people actually subscribe to this channel. So if you were to that, it would really help. It could mean we could continue to grow. If not, thanks for watching and see you on the next show. And you also might like this video right here. All right. Thanks again.